Hello there. Okay, so in this video, we will be discussing pawn shops. Mainly, we're going to look at Presidential Decree number 114, which guided essentially the establishment and operation of pawn shops. So this is pretty old. It was made in 1973, and pawn shop as a non-bank financial institution is also being monitored by Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So any recent guidelines for pawn shops are normally included in the BSP circulars. Oh, our dog is barking mad. Okay, he's done barking. Okay, so let's talk about pawn shops and why is it that we have pawn shops. Okay, so the main financial institution are banks, right? So these banks normally they cater to individuals who have stable source of income, so normally employees. Okay, and then especially if they are lending their money to borrowers, individuals, normally their requirements would include either certificate of employment, pay slips, or what do you call this? Income tax return, ITR, which would prove that the person is earning a stable amount of money every month, okay, consistently. So in a way, people who have no regular jobs, who are earning on a contractual basis or some sort of contracted work, so they cannot provide these documents to the bank. So in a way, they cannot avail of certain financial services provided by bank. And if they do have legit, reasons for borrowing money or for wanting to avail of loans from financial institutions, so they have other options, which is, going to the pawn shops instead of the banks. So in pawn shops, normally what you need to present are properties or collateral. Before they do require or they do accept land or house and lot, titles, or car, I think. Do they? I'm not sure about that because essentially you have to leave the evidence of ownership to the pawn shop. So no, I don't think cars are included, but currently they do accept gadgets, laptops, smartphones, what do you call that? Smartwatch, and then jewelries, of course. So these are the items that they do accept as pawns, and then they can lend money to the owner up to a certain amount of the valuation of the property or item. Okay, so that's essentially how pawn shops work. And then normally their interest rates are much higher than the banks, and also they do have shorter credit terms, so you have to repay them in, let's say, 3 months or 6 months or 1 year. And then in a way they are protected, or they are mitigating the risk involved in lending money to these people who have no stable income by, having physical possession of the title or the item itself. All right. So in case this borrower defaults in paying or repaying the loan, then the pawn shop would own the property, and then they can legally sell the item for a price, and then the proceeds of the sale would then apply to the balance of the loan or the debt of the owner. Okay, and then I think normally they are sold in an amount not that far from the balance of the loan. So if there is any excess, then that would go to the owner. I think it depends on the kind of agreement that the person had with a pawn shop. All right, and later we'll check with that one. I'm not sure, but there are different types of in auction. Sometimes if the value of the property that was pawned, if it was sold for a higher price, sometimes the excess over the loan amount would go to the owner. Sometimes it would go to the pawn shop, and then in the reverse case, if the sale or the proceeds from the sale of the pawned item is less than the balance of the loan, sometimes the pawn shop would require the borrower to repay the difference, or sometimes the pawn shop would shoulder the difference, some sort of loss on their part. Okay, so sometimes it would depend on the agreement between the borrower and the pawn shop. Okay, but those are some of the cases that happens. All right, so now we're going to look over the presidential decree that is what do you call this, that is the legal basis on why pawn shops exist. Okay, so this is Presidential Decree number 114 from 1973, title Regulating the Establishment and Operation of Pawn Shops. Okay, so what do you call this? Statements. Whereas pawn shops provide an additional source of credit, especially for small borrowers left unserved by the banking and other financial institutions in the country. Whereas there is no specific law in the Philippines that governs pawn shop establishments, particularly providing definite and uniform standards for their operation. And then, whereas the recommendations contained in a report on the financial system, which have been accepted with modifications by monetary authorities, strongly advocate the enactment of a law regulating pawn shops. Okay, I think there was a time when pawn shops are usurious, or they are imposing higher rates of interest na in a way it's advantageous to the pawn shops, but it's very disadvantageous to the public or to the people who are pawning their items. So it came to a point that it has been recommended that they be regulated as well by the government. Okay. Short title, this decree may be cited as the Pawn Shop Regulation Act, Declaration of Policy. It is hereby declared the policy of the state to regulate the establishment of pawn shops and to place their operation on a sound and stable basis to derive the optimum advantages from them as an additional source of credit, to prevent and mitigate as far as practicable practices prejudicial to public interest, and to lay down the minimum requirements and standards under which they may be established and do business. Okay, so as a non-bank financial institution, as a financial institution, so they do contribute in the economic growth and development of the country, because they provide as a source of credit to some other people who might be able to use it to conduct their business, or in a way to use it in a production of any product or services. Okay, most of the time these are they cater to, before, way back, they cater to people with land titles, with land ownerships, but they don't have jobs or stable jobs, and they normally work in the farms in their land that they own. And sometimes it would come to a point that they would need money and they have no other source, so they are in a way forced to sell their properties. Okay, sometimes it's for personal reasons, health reasons. Sometimes it's because our country is very prone to natural calamities. So we have typhoons every year. So sometimes the farm owners, the landowners, they would suffer losses because the crops would be essentially ruined by calamities, and they would suffer great losses that sometimes they are left with no financial resources. They would turn to pawning the property, and most of the time there would be a lot of people that cannot repay the loan. So what happens when a borrower again cannot repay the loan is that the pawn shop would essentially become the owner of the property, and they would auction it so that they could get proceeds, and they could get the money or the monetary value, and again use that in their operation as well. Okay, so what else? So essentially, that's the operation of pawnshops. That's how they work. Section 3, definitions as used in this decree, unless the context otherwise requires, the following terms shall have the following meanings. Pawnshop shall refer to a person or entity engaged in the business of lending money on personal property delivered as security for loans, and shall be synonymous and may be used interchangeably with pawnbroker or pawn brokerage. Okay, so pawnshop is either it's a person or the establishment or the entity that's engaged in the pawning business. Okay. Pawner shall refer to the borrower from the pawn shop. Okay, so a person, a client who owns a certain property, and then he would bring it to the pawn shop so that he could borrow money. Pawnee shall refer to the pawn shop or pawnbroker or the pawn shop itself. Pawn is the personal property delivered by the pawner to the pawnee as security for a loan. Okay, so currently pawn could be gadgets, electronic gadgets. So you have your smartphones, smartwatch, laptops, and then of course jewelries, and then you have your land titles, normally house and lot. All right. Pawn ticket is the pawnbroker's receipt for a pawn. So when you go and borrow money and then you leave your property at the pawn shop, so you'll get a pawn ticket. So essentially it provides the what do you call this, the item, the name, any registration number or something, the date, description, things like that. So it is neither a security nor a printed evidence of indebtedness. Okay? It's only some sort of identification for you to know which of the items in the pawn shop is the one that you pawn to them. Okay? Because sometimes people might be bringing in the same type or model of property. Essentially nowadays gadgets are allowed to be pawned, so you might see a lot of iPhones or a lot of same type of smartphones on the pawn shop. All right. Property shall include only such personal property as may actually be delivered to the control and possession of the pawnshop, provided, however, that certain specified chattels, such as guns, knives, and similar weapons, whose reception in pawnshop is expressly prohibited by other laws or regulations, shall not be included. So normally a personal property, and then exclusive, not including weapons. So you have your guns, knives, and similar weapons, probably swords, if there's still. Okay, Section 4, form of organization. Why is that dog barking? Okay, it's gone quiet. Form of organization, a pawnshop may be established as a single proprietorship, partnership, or corporation. So any of the available forms of business. Section 5, registration and licensing. Any person or entity desiring to engage in the pawnshop business shall register with the Bureau of Commerce, currently Department of Trade and Industry for sole proprietor, and then SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, for partnership or corporation. And then secure a license from the appropriate city or municipality having territorial jurisdiction over the place of establishment and operation. So some sort of barangay permit, and then you also have to get mayor's permit, and then of course you have to register with the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Okay, Section 6, requirement of registration with the central bank, because they're a financial institution, and bank financial institution, they have to be monitored by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Any individual, corporation, or association duly registered and licensed to engage in the pawnshop business shall file an information sheet under oath with the central bank before commencement of actual operations. Okay. Provided, however, that pawnshops duly licensed and operating before the approval of this decree shall, within 6 months from the date of effectivity of the same, register with the central bank. For this purpose, the central bank shall furnish pawnshops upon request with necessary copies of the prescribed information sheet. Okay. So currently, registration is direct with the central bank. If you want to establish a pawn shop, you have to get a registration. You have to be registered with the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Section 7, this was the initial capitalization back then, but of course this has changed over the years. There's a different minimum capital required now. The minimum paid-in capital of any pawn shop, which may be established after the effectivity of this decree, shall be 100,000 pesos during that time. Due to inflation and all that. So this amount is really a high amount back then. I'm going to scold that dog for a bit. So, okay, so where are we? Okay, back then the required minimum capital is 100,000 pesos. And then they have this transitionary provision for those already existing before the passage of the decree. Section 8, citizenship requirement. Upon the effectivity of this decree, only Filipino citizens may establish and own a pawn shop organized in the form of single proprietor. So, foreigners, they cannot register as a pawn shop with the business form of single proprietor, right? Provided, however, that in the case of partnership or corporation, at least 70% of its capital shall be owned by Filipino citizens. Provided further that in the case of a corporation, at least 70% of the voting stock capital shall be owned by citizens of the Philippines. Or if there be no capital stock, at least 70% of the members entitled to vote shall be citizens of the Philippines. Essentially the same. Okay, but back then it's 70%. I think nowadays it's 60 Filipinos and then 40% could be foreigners. Okay, they lowered it a bit, but essentially majority of it is still Filipino, right? 60% and then 40% could be foreigners. Of course, it could be 100% owned by Filipinos. But the limitation is that only up to 40% could be owned by foreigners. So in a way, that dog is... Okay, so that was seriously frustrating. Okay, where are we again? Okay, foreign ownership. So essentially, from back then it's 70-30, but again, at this point it's currently 60-40. So this is to encourage foreign investment because, there could be foreigners living in the country who would like to invest. And, Filipino businessmen, sometimes they don't have enough capital, so they would partner with foreigners, pitch their business idea and then ask them for capital. Okay, so the 60-40 requirement allows foreigners to invest in Philippine businesses, alright? But still, of course, to protect the interest of the Filipinos, majority of the ownership should still be owned by Filipinos. Okay, it's practically the same anywhere in the world. So most countries, they do have that limitation on foreign ownership, alright? And then just a side note, there are particular types of businesses that should be owned by Filipinos 100%. No foreign ownership is allowed. So mostly these are, utility companies. And essentially those that are providing public services, right? Okay, so next, percentage of foreign-owned voting stock. Okay, 30% back then. Now it's up to 40%. Percentage of foreign-owned voting stock in any pawn shop shall be determined by the citizenship of the individual stockholders in that pawn shop. In the case of corporations owning shares in a pawn shop, the citizenship of the individual owners of voting stock in such corporations shall be the basis of computing the percentage. Section 9, amount of loan. Pawn shops may grant such amount of loans as may be agreed upon between the parties, provided that the amount of loan shall in no case be less than 30% of the appraised value of the security offered for the loan unless the pawner manifests in writing the desire to borrow a lesser amount. Okay, so this has something to do with the operation of pawn shops. So you have the pawn, the item, okay, and then the pawn shop would appraise or assess the current value of the item. So not it doesn't necessarily mean that you bought an item for, let's say, 10,000. When you bring it to the pawn shop, of course, they have to consider, you know, the current market values, the fact that the item has been used already, or the nature. Is it a gadget or is it a jewelry? So normally, if it's a jewelry gem, so the value appreciates most of the time. But if it's a usable gadget, so normally, that's depreciating. The amount is depreciable. All right, so they do have these rule that sometimes it would depend on the pawn shop. Sometimes they can lend as much as 80% of the appraised value of the property, and then others they only lend up to 70% of the appraised value. Okay, so what's the difference for? So in case that the borrower is unable to repay the loan, so the pawn shop, you know, they would have some sort of cost in auctioning the item, right? So it's possible that they might not be able to find a buyer quickly for that property to be disposed, so that the proceeds of the sale could be applied to the balance of the loan. So they do have that, what do you call this, allowance for those types of expenses. So the 20 to 30%, that's what they would use for those expenses. That's why they do not loan the whole 100% of the appraised value of the property or the item. Okay, and then this section 9, they do have what do they call that? The floor limit. They cannot lend less than 30% of the pawned item. Okay, unless that's what the borrower wants. Okay, for them to be able to probably, you know, prepay the loan. So sometimes they would borrow a lesser amount, just enough for what they needed, for what they need, and that would also allow them to be able to repay much easier. Okay, so they can, you know, manifest or make a statement, an affidavit, that that's only the amount or that they want to borrow. Okay, which is essentially lesser than 30% of the appraised value of the property. They also call it security, okay, the pawn. Section 10, rates of interest. No pawn shop shall directly or indirectly stipulate, charge, demand, take, or receive any higher rate or greater sum or value for any loan or forbearance than the rate allowed by the usury law for such transactions. So currently, interest rates are being monitored by the BSP. Any changes, you know, due to inflation, current market conditions, it will come from the BSP, okay, the current market interest rate. Okay, and then all the banks and non-bank financial institutions, they are required to follow the limit set by BSP or the Monetary Board. All right. It shall be unlawful for a pawn shop to divide the pawn offered by a pawner in order to collect greater interest and or to require the pawner to pay an additional charge as insurance premium for the safekeeping and conservation of the article pawn. What do you mean divide? Divide the pawn offered by a pawner. I will leave it at that. Okay, you cannot divide the pawn. Okay, so maybe, you know, you take it as a whole, the item. All right. In addition to interest charges, pawn shops may impose a maximum of service charge of 5 pesos, but in no case to exceed 1% of the principal loan. So they do have limit 1%. This is during that time. Okay, so probably right now it's around 1 to 5%, 2 to 5%, something like that. Section 11, maintenance of records. Every pawnbroker shall keep a memorandum book in which shall be entered in ink at the time of each loan or pledge an accurate account and description in Filipino or English with corresponding translation in the local dialect of every pawn, the amount of money loaned thereon, the date of pawning or pledging the same, the rate of interest to be paid on the loan, and the name and residence of each pawner, together with a particular description of such pawner, including his or her nationality, sex, and general appearance, and no pawnbroker or other person shall alter or erase any entry made in such book. So some sort of, record, just to ensure that you know who pawned an item, or you can find him. Some sort of, KYC, know your customer records. All financial institutions do implement KYC. Okay, each client has some sort of profile or information, client information. And of course, it's being protected naman by the Data Privacy Act, so it's fine. Every person pawning or pledging any article or thing with a pawnbroker shall sign his name and give his address to said pawnbroker, and such name and address shall be made part of the record heretofore described in this section, provided that the person who is unable to write shall imprint his stamp mark, and his name shall be written by a competent person, who shall sign his own name as witness to said stamp mark. Alright. Section 12, pawn ticket. Each pawnbroker shall, at the time of every such loan or pledge, deliver to each person pawning or pledging any article or thing a memorandum or ticket signed by such pawnbroker and containing the substance of the record required to be kept in such pawnbroker's memorandum book in section 11 hereof, excluding the description of the person so pawning or pledging such article or thing, and no compensation of any kind whatsoever shall be received by any pawnbroker for any such memorandum or ticket. Okay, so essentially, supposedly, there's no cost or fee to be charged on, issuing the pawn ticket. Redemption, section 13. The pawner who fails to pay his obligation on the date it falls due may, within 90 days from the date of maturity of the obligation, redeem the pawn by payment of the principal of the debt with interest. Okay, so they do have this rule. So due date, if the borrower cannot pay, so they still have 90 days to redeem the pawn. All right. And then after that, provided, however, that for the purpose of computing interest due after maturity of the obligation, the basis shall be the sum of the principal of the obligation and interest earned at the time the obligation matured. Okay, so you have your principal and then the interest, and then you have the due date. On the due date, what needs to be paid is, of course, the principal and the interest, right? But since the borrower has not been able to pay, so there's an extension, right, of 90 days. So for that period, another interest will be imposed, to the unpaid balance. Okay, so the new interest from the date it becomes due to until the date it gets redeemed. So there's going to be an interest rate imposed on the principal. Let's just call it the outstanding balance of the loan, right? So the outstanding balance would be the principal and the interest before maturity or at maturity. Okay. Section 14, disposition of pawn on default of pawner. In the event that the pawner fails to redeem the pawn within 90 days from the date of maturity of the obligation in accordance with the preceding section, the pawnbroker may sell or otherwise dispose of any article taken or received by him in pawn, provided, however, that the pawner shall be duly notified of such sale on or before the termination of the 90-day period. The notice particularly stating the date, hour, and place of sale. Because, normally, the person who pawned the item can also attend the auction if it's an auction. And he can also participate in the... Wait, are they allowed? There are sometimes they are, or maybe they could, what do you call this? I think it was against the law. Sometimes I forget, business law, negotiable instruments. There are some, conditions or stipulations about the ability of the owner to join the auction. I think there are certain conditions, okay, but I don't remember everything. Okay, but maybe later we'll go through them. Probably do a video on auction. Okay, so essentially, before the item is sold off or put on sale, so the pawn shop would have to notify the owner of it. Okay, so currently it's somewhat easy to do because you have your phone numbers And most of the time at the beginning, before the borrower is, given the money, the request for loan is processed. Of course, they would be informed that after due date, you have this number of days to redeem it. If you're unable to redeem it, then we are allowed, or you're, you automatically know that it will be put on sale after that certain amount of time has passed and you haven't paid the balance yet of your loan. Okay. Section 15, Public Auction of Pawned Articles. No pawnbroker shall sell or otherwise dispose of any article or thing taken or received in pawn or pledge except at public auction in his place of business as such pawnbroker or in any other public place within the territorial limits of the municipality or city where the pawn shop has its place of business. Okay, so normally when you go to pawn shops, you would see the display, and normally what's on display are items that are already put up on sale, because those are the only items that they are allowed to sell. Okay, there's properties that are within the period allowed for the borrower to redeem, so they're mostly at the back, okay, being stored, and then that's it. We're just waiting to be redeemed or to be sold off later on, to be put on sale later on if the owner defaults. Okay, normally the auction happens inside the pawn shop, or sometimes they would make announcements. They would make banners stating when they're going to hold a public auction, and then of course in the auction an item will be sold off to the highest bidder. Sometimes the amount could go up or could go beyond the appraised value of the property, or sometimes it could go under. So in a way, sometimes it would depend on the situation or the current economic condition, and the availability of the buyers who are willing to pay money for such item. Okay. Nor shall any such article or thing be sold or disposed of unless said pawnbroker has published a notice once in at least 2 daily newspapers printed in the municipality or city or municipality during the week preceding the date of such sale. In remote areas where the newspapers are neither published nor circulated, notice by newspaper publication shall be substituted by posting notices in conspicuous public places within the territorial limits of the city or municipality where the pawn shop has its place of business. Normally just, outside the pawn shop, you'll see the dates if they do have upcoming auctions. Said notice, whether published or posted, shall be in English and either in Filipino or in the local dialect, and shall contain the name of the pawn shop, its owner, address of the establishment, hour and date of the auction sale. Section 16, Closing and Removal of Business Period. No pawnbroker shall close or transfer his place of business within 3 months after the expiration of the period for which any article or thing shall have been taken or received by him at his place of business in pawn or pledge, or before any such article or thing shall have been sold or otherwise disposed of in accordance with the provisions of this decree. Provided, however, that removal or transfer of the pawnbroker's place of business from one place to another within the territorial limits of the same city or municipality may be authorized, on condition that the pawnbroker shall publish a notice of such removal in 2 local daily papers, one in English, another in Filipino or in the local dialect, for a period of not less than 3 days, the last day of which shall take place 5 days before the removal, stating in the notice the date of removal, address of the premises to be vacated, and of the premises to which the pawn shop will be transferred, and that he shall likewise post in conspicuous place in both premises 1 copy of the notice in English and another in either Filipino or the local dialect during the period of its publication in the said local papers. Okay, so essentially, this section is about transfer of the place of business. So if it's within the same city, so it's enough that you put a notice, probably in the old place, and then some sort of notice that we're moving to a different place, and then you put the address all our previous customers, all our customers could find us there, something like that. And if they could also provide contact number, so that's also good. Okay, but if it's, you know, from one city or municipality to another, so they might be required to publish it in the newspapers. Okay, and then they also have a number of months, 3 months, yeah, for before they could transfer. They have to stay, you know, provide notice and then stay there for 3 months so that their last customers would still be able to find them there for the redemption, right? Because the redemption period back then is 90 days or 3 months, all right? So during that period, probably they're not going to, you know, receive any new customers, because if they do, they will have to wait another 90 days before they can go off, right, to another location. Okay, so essentially it's just, you know, about proper information before they transfer places. Currently it's much easier to do because you can simply, if you do have the contact numbers of your customers, you can just do information drive, send them text messages, or if you have social media pages, you can just announce it there as well, right? Section 17, grant of authority to the central bank. The central bank is hereby authorized to issue rules and regulations to implement the provisions contained herein, to require from Pawnshops reports of condition and such other reports necessary to determine compliance with the provisions of this decree, to exercise visitatorial powers whenever deemed necessary, and to impose such administrative sanctions, including the imposition of fines for violations of this decree and regulations issued by the central bank in pursuance thereto. Okay, so aside from this presidential decree, the other, you know, guidelines that may apply to pawnshops, those can be found from BSP circulars. Section 18, penalties. A fine of not less than 100 pesos and not more than 1,000 pesos, or imprisonment for not less than 30 days and not more than 1 year, or both, at the discretion of the court, shall be imposed for violations of the provisions of this decree and its implementing rules and regulations. So again, this is back then. 100 pesos is a lot of money at that time, could buy a lot. And then maximum is 1,000, or imprisonment not less than 30 days, not more than 1 year, or both. Okay. Provided that if the violation is committed by a corporation, partnership, or an association, the penalty provided for in this decree shall be imposed upon the directors, officers, employees, or persons therein responsible for the offense, without prejudice to civil liabilities arising from the criminal offense. Okay. So again, this is back then. Currently, probably the amount of fines is much higher, adjusted for, you know, current value of money. But essentially, this part, the imposition of the fines to non-individual, what do you call this? Non-individual employees, officers of, if the form of organization is partnership or corporation. Okay, essentially they're they're not natural persons, they're only juridical persons. So it would fall on the officers, board members, or employees to, what do you call this, to be held accountable. Okay. Section 19, matters not covered by this decree. Provisions of existing law, insofar as they are not in conflict with any provision of this decree, shall apply in matters not otherwise specifically provided for in this decree. Okay. Separability clause. If any provision or section of this decree or the application thereof to any person or circumstances held invalid, the other provisions or sections of this decree and the application of such provisions or sections to other persons or circumstances shall not be affected thereby. Okay, so essentially, matters not covered by this decree. Almost every law, presidential decree, executive ordinance, or Republic Act, they do have these sections, right? So essentially, they're just saying that, you know, if there are other laws that are, what do you call this? They do have provisions and not in conflict with the provision of this decree. So those would apply, what do you call this? Those would apply even if they are not specifically provided in this particular law, right? And then separability clause, if there's any clause statement that is held invalid or, you know, without effect, so the other clauses that are valid, that are legal, would still, be valid, right? And then effectivity, this decree shall take effect immediately. So January 29, 1973. Okay, so this is the regulation for Pawnshops, Presidential Decree number 114. I'm going to see if I could provide additional information for the current operations of Pawnshops. All right, maybe I'm just going to add an article in the description, see if there's additional information there. But for now, this is it for the discussion about Pawnshops. And then I would also be providing the link to this document, regulations. Normally, these can be found in the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas website. Alright, but I'll still be providing the link in the description of the video. Okay, so that's it for this one. Thanks and bye.